Hello, my name is Mark Gibson, and you're listening to the podcast version of the Teagasc Signpost Series, a weekly webinar that promotes and examines sustainability in Irish farming.
Good morning, and you're very welcome to another Signpost Series webinar. I hope you're all keeping well, and we're looking forward to another very interesting presentation ahead. There's been a lot of conversation recently, in particular the last couple of years, around catch crops. And I suppose it's a key tool for farmers, I suppose, to use on the farm to help tackle the problems ahead. But can they play a vital role in agriculture to reduce nutrient loss, improve soils, and contribute to long-term productivity? And we're delighted to be joined this morning by Dr. Bridget Lynch, Teagasc Research Officer and Manager in the Agricultural Catchments Programme, and Dr. Richie Hackett, Teagasc Crops Research Officer, to discuss the research. Good morning, Bridget. Good morning, Richie.
Morning.
How are you all keeping today?
Good, yeah.
Very good.
Yeah. Nice day here in Wexford.
Good, that's the main thing. I think more to come as well. And I'm sure Carlo's nice and dry down to Richie as well.
Yeah, a little bit too dry, I suppose, but we won't complain too much.
Yeah, that's a dirty word. Yeah. We're also joined by Teagasc Crops Specialist Shay, Phelan, who's going to help me out with questions today. Good morning, Shay. How are you?
How are you going, Cathal?
You're keeping well.
Yeah, like that. I'm up here with Richie in Oak Park, and it's dry at the moment, but I think there's rain forecast for this afternoon, so it'll delay winter harvest a little, winter barley harvest a little bit, So.
Yeah. We were down Bridget in Moore Park as well during the week. It's quite dry down there as well, but lots of parts of countries have got the rain, but there is parts that haven't. So yeah, we'll do a little bit of a rain dance and maybe get the Child of Prague back out from under the bush and put him back inside in the press again, see we'll get some rain. I suppose, Bridget, just to kick off a little bit, the EPA report came out there during the week there, and I suppose it's talking a lot about nitrate and estuaries and stuff like that. I suppose so catch crops is a tool to help to reduce losses. These type of tools have to be very desirable for farmers.
Yeah, so the EPA report came out on Wednesday, and it's the 2024 report, so it kind of reports on 2024 alone. The EPA bring out different reports cyclically, and in 2024 we had a 10% reduction nationally, so that's good. I suppose the dial is moving in the right direction for nitrate in river water. But regards catch crops, like we've still a job to do in the southeast, and the cover crops is, I suppose, a tool that's applicable to tillage farmers where we've dominant land use in tillage in the southeast. Look, where there's supports now, whether it's through acres or through the EIP, which we can talk about later. Now, to cover the cost of sowing cover crops, we did work a couple of years ago where we surveyed farmers and stakeholders in the area here in Wexford, and I suppose farmers see the benefit for reducing nitrate loss and benefit in water quality, but they see the other benefits, so the soil health benefits, the drainage benefits, as well as sort of the water quality benefits. So they are very positively disposed to it, and now there's good supports there to get them in the ground.
Yeah, I know from talking to a lot of tillage farmers doing soil stuff over the years that, building organic matter and soil structure is always high on the agenda, so that's positive. And Richie, I know you had a very good open day down in Oak Park recently, very successful, I think, and big crowds turned out. Were you demoing catch crops down there in the day?
Yeah, there was catch crops were featured in a number of the stands, but I suppose Veronica Nyhan had a soil pit with examples of catch crops, the root systems of catch crops, and that attracted a lot of interest. So she had some of the more common catch crops that are grown, like phacelia and mustard and crimson clover, buckwheat, that sort of thing. So that was very interesting for growers to actually see the catch crop above ground and below ground. So that generated a lot of interest on the day.
Yeah, it's always better to see it in real life in the skin, isn't it? And ask the questions when you're there. Just to remind everyone, we're going to be recording today's session, and please submit your questions to the Q&A tab, and Shay will be there to help me there at the end. So Richie, if you would like to get your presentation ready, and just as you're getting ready, just to remind everyone that there is a podcast version of the Signpost Series webinar available to listen to when you're out on the move or up in the tractor or wherever you have a few minutes. And also to remember that it is available on Teagasc website. You can watch it back as well. So, okay, Richie, I think you're good to go. So we'll let you off.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the research that either we've done ourselves or from some international work, and what it says about catch crops. I suppose, first of all, a little bit of introduction as to what catch crops are, just in case there's anybody that's new to the area. I suppose they're plant species or species mixtures sown between two arable cash crops when the land would otherwise be bare. So generally, we're talking about over the autumn-winter period before a spring crop when there would be no crop in the ground traditionally. I suppose the key thing about them is they're not grown as a cash crop, so they're not grown to generate a financial income generally, and they're normally not fertilized. That's not to say you won't get some income by grazing or whatever, but they're generally not, the main objective isn't to generate income with them. Generally grown to provide an ecosystem service. There's a lot of different names used to describe catch crops, which can be a little bit confusing. And I suppose the name often depends on what the objectives of the growing the catch crop is. So if the objective is to catch nutrients and prevent them from being leached, as often it is in Ireland, they're often called catch crops. They can also be called cover crops, and that probably originated from the Dust Bowl in America back in the earlier part of the last century, where they cover the soil and prevent the soil from being lost. Green manures is another term that can be used, and that's where they're grown to improve soil characteristics or to provide a specific benefit to a succeeding crop. Forage crops is sometimes a term that's used to describe them. I wouldn't use it myself because I would term a forage crop as something that's grown and managed specifically to produce forage. So it's not really to produce the ecosystem services we're talking about. It's grown specifically to produce forage, but some people would include it as a catch crop. I suppose, why would anyone grow them? Well, they have a lot of potential benefits, and I suppose I've the potential underlined because we don't automatically get all these benefits, but we can get many of these benefits if we manage correctly. I suppose the biggest benefit is reduction of nutrient loss, and particularly nitrate, and as we discussed earlier, that's particularly important in the arable parts of the country at the moment. But it can prevent soil erosion as well and loss of soil through overland flow. They can provide some nutrients to the next crop, and in so doing reduce the fertilizer requirement, but as we'll see that can be quite limited and quite unpredictable. They can provide some yield benefits to the succeeding crop as well. Many growers use them as a source of forage during the early spring period before they incorporate the crops back into the soil before sowing the cash crop, and that can be a benefit. And then there's various soil characteristics that they can improve, such as organic matter structure and soil biology in general. And they can have positive effects on reducing pests and diseases and weeds in the succeeding crop as well on occasion. But it's not all positive. There can be some potential drawbacks as well. I suppose they can have a negative effect on the succeeding crop, either through an allelopathic effect, where there's chemicals exuded from the cover crop that affect the growth of the following crop, or they can carry over pests or diseases. And I suppose in this instance, clubroot in oilseed rape or brassica, where brassica cover crops are used, is one that's quite can be quite a serious problem if it occurs. And there are numerous situations out there where cover crops have been suspected of increasing the amount of clubroot in the ground. I suppose one that we sometimes don't think about is there can be a competition for time resource, because these are established during the very busy harvest period when growers are very busy trying to get their harvest saved, and it can be quite difficult to devote the time to actually sowing cover crops at that period. And there is a cost involved in sowing these, so you've got a cost and a seed cost, you've got whatever cost you incur putting the seed into the soil, and then you have a destruction cost at the far end. And because of that, there can be a net cost in the system. If we don't get benefits from the cover crops, they can add a net cost to the system. But management can help, and we now have some very good external support in Ireland in the form of acres and DEIP, which will help to mitigate any cost effects. What impact can they have on the various parameters that I've mentioned? This is just a review. There was an international review where they reviewed a lot of studies from around the world and looking at how they affected a couple of parameters such as nitrate leaching, grain yield of the succeeding crop, crop N uptake of the succeeding crop, and soil carbon levels. And I suppose there's 4 graphs here, and what we're really interested in looking at is the solid. There's 3 solid lines in each graph, and they represent what happened after a non-legume cover crop, a legume cover crop, or a mix of a legume and a non-legume. And basically, if we look at the nitrate leaching, we can see that all those lines are sloping down as you go from left to right. And that's basically saying that the cover crop had a very significant effect in reducing nitrate leaching. If we look at the other graphs, there's not so much of a slope on the lines, which suggests that the cover crop weren't having as a big an effect on those other parameters. In the grain yield graph, some of the lines are actually sloping slightly downwards. And similarly, in the crop N uptake of the succeeding crop, there are some slight negative effects of the cover crop versus a control where there was no cover crop, no cover at all. And in the soil carbon, there's slight increases through the use of cover crops, but they are quite modest in terms of the increase that you were seeing, which is what many people have found. In terms of some of our own work, we've looked at cover crops, the effect of cover crops on nitrate leaching. And this is a study we did on a very light leaching prone soil where we had 3 covers. We either had a bare stubble with no green cover at all. We had a sown mustard cover crop, or we had natural regeneration. And I'm not going to go through these 3 graphs, but if we just look at the central graph here, we can see that the mustard, which is the red line, decreased the amount of nitrate in the water that was leaving the root zone at 90 centimeters quite dramatically, and reduced it to almost 0. Where we had natural regeneration, which is the blue line, we did get a decrease, but not quite as big a decrease as with the mustard. And then the control, if you like, the bare soil had reasonably high levels of nitrate leaving the soil system, and was similar trends, maybe not as dramatic in the other 3 years. I would say in that central graph that leaching was begun quite late in that year. It was in December before leaching really started. So the cover crop had quite a long period to have its effect, whereas in the other years on either side, leaching occurred earlier. So there was less opportunity for the cover crop to have its effect. Yeah, so in terms of summing up all that data, we looked at what effect they had over the 3 years of the study. And when we look at this sown mustard cover crop, it was reducing the N concentration in the drainage water by up to 86%, and the natural regeneration was still giving us a reduction, but not as significant as the sown mustard cover crop. And the effects on the nitrogen load being lost, the actual kilos of nitrate being lost per hectare, followed a similar trend. I would say this is a very light soil, very high leaching risk soil, which wouldn't be overly typical of tillage soils in general. But we set up this experiment specifically to examine how effective cover crops could be in Irish conditions. I suppose the next question is, well, what should you sow? What species are we talking about? And what characteristics should we take into account when we're deciding what to sow? I suppose there's a few things we should consider. Rotation is probably the first one. We want to always avoid sowing cover crops that will cause a problem for the succeeding cash crop. And I mentioned the example of clubroot earlier, where if you sow a brassica cover crop, you can increase the risk of having clubroot in an oilseed rape crop that follows. And the problem with that is that's a long-lasting problem. If you have a problem with clubroot, it's going to last 15, 20 years before you're clear of it again. Seed cost can be another thing to take into account, because some of the seeds can be quite expensive, and if you're not getting a benefit from them, well, then that can turn out to be a net cost on your system. The method of sowing will also maybe dictate what you sow, because if you have mixtures of big seeds and small seeds, that can be difficult to broadcast if you're using a broadcast type system, whereas if you're using a drill to sow them, that's less of an issue. So we have to consider things like that as well. And I suppose one of the main ones we need to think about is what actually do we want the cover crop to do? So some cover crops might be better for improving soil structure. Some might be better for having a positive effect on the succeeding crop, such as maybe for legumes, which are adding nitrogen into the system. And we need to be sure of what we want to get from the succeeding crop. And in many cases, we'll probably be using mixtures of cover crops to try and get as many benefits as possible. And I suppose the method of destruction that we're going to use needs to be taken into account as well. Some crops are if we're just going to directly plough the crop into the soil without any previous cutting or whatever, then we want a reasonably low growing cover crop that will make it that bit easier to get good coverage. In terms of the options that are out there, I suppose there's a few groups that are used quite commonly. Brassicas are probably one of the more common options that are used, and there's various species of brassicas such as mustard, radish, fodder rape, and numerous others. You can use cereals or sometimes grasses, so like the likes of oats and rye can be used as cover crops, as various legumes that can be used. And then there's a range of other species such as phacelia, linseed, sunflower, buckwheat, and there is a range of other ones that can be used. So there's a large selection of species that we can use. I suppose using mixtures is probably quite common, and in many of the schemes you have to use a mixture of at least two. And in that case, one species can compensate for another. If one is having a poor year, the other can make up for it. And different species will provide different benefits. This is just some N uptake data that we use from different cover crops, and what we can see is that a lot of cover crops can give good N uptake. It will vary between years, but you can get quite good N uptake with a lot of cover crops. I mentioned mixtures, and there's a lot of debate as to whether how many species you should have in mixtures, or whether you should use mixtures at all. This was just a review that was done a couple of years ago now, where a group reviewed experiments from around the world looking at if there was a benefit to using mixtures versus just a single species. And in this case, they defined a mixture as being better than a single species if the mixture had a better outcome than the best of the component single species. So they weren't comparing the mixture to the average of the components; they were comparing it to the best of the components. And on this graph, we have a range of different characteristics or benefits they looked at in terms of the mixtures, in terms of crop productivity, weed suppression, nitrogen retention, some soil characteristics, and crop yield. And basically what we're looking at here, there's a zero line on the center of the graph. And then we have little rectangles, or as a box plot, we have rectangles for each characteristic, and there's a line somewhere in near the center of each of those rectangles. And if that line is left of the zero line, the monoculture was better, and if it's right of the line, the mixture was better. And in general, what they found was that in most cases, the mixture was comparable to the best monoculture. In some cases, the monoculture was actually better, where there was just one species, and in a small amount of cases, the mixture was better. So there's no disadvantage to using mixtures, but there's probably no huge big advantage either, although we would generally say that you should use at least two species just to give yourself some safety. In terms of effects on following a crop, this is some work where we looked at the effect of a range of different cover crops on the yield of the following crop. And what we were on this was on a light soil, and we were comparing it to where there was just bare stubble. And what we found out in this case, there was some benefits, and some quite substantial benefits in terms of the effects on the succeeding crop from some cover crops. On occasion, there was negative effects, and oftentimes where there's an NS, there was the difference wasn't significant. We also did the same, a subset of those species on a more medium textured soil. And we found that we could find no positive effect on the succeeding crop and the yield of the succeeding spring barley crop. And this sort of aligns with some work that I saw from some Danish work, where they found that the benefits of cover crops on the succeeding crop were often best on a light soil. I suppose the one thing that we do need to be very clear on is that the sowing date has a large effect on anything that happens with cover crops. This is some work we did where we had 3 sowing dates of mustard in this case: July 30th, August 18th, and September 8th, and we looked at the N uptake over in December from those 3 sowing dates, and we can see that the July 30th had the highest N uptake. The August 18 sown cover crop still had very good N uptake compared to the natural regeneration, which is the stripe bar. And then the cover crop that was sown on September 8 was no different to the just whatever weeds grew in the field where there was no cover crop. So sowing date is quite important in terms of maximizing the benefits of the cover crop. We took those, after we sowed those cover crops, we sowed spring barley, and we measured the grain yield of the spring barley after those 3 different cover crops. And what we found was, particularly for the 2 earlier sown dates, there was a small increase in yield compared to where there was no cover crop. But where the cover crop was sown on the 8th of September, it was no different. Yield was no different to where there had been no cover crop. And when we worked out the fertilizer value of these, it was relatively small. It was less than 10 kilos for the July 30th and the August 18th. And then for the September 8th, there was no, you couldn't reduce your fertilizer nitrogen with that late sown cover crop. So then in summary, so cover crops or catch crops can have many benefits. I would say the main one is, a most consistent one, is nitrate leaching. And they can have some positive effects on soil parameters. They do take time to become measurable. There can be effects on grain yield, but they can be very, very variable. There can be positive effects on the N requirement of the following crop, but they're often small, except where you have legumes, a significant amount of legumes in the mix. They do invoke additional costs, and as a result of that, economic benefits can be small in the absence of a financial incentive. But management, particularly sowing date, crop choice, and year will all affect that. I suppose early sowing, if I can, one key message: early sowing is very important. So with that, I will hand over to Bridget.
So I'm going to build on Richie's presentation and give an update on the work, I suppose, that we have done in the Agriculture Catchments Programme and what's happening at the minute, and a bit of what ongoing work, so people are familiar with what we have running at the minute. On a water quality side, 58% of riversides nationally have high to good status for nitrate concentrations, but there's over 40% of unsatisfactory nitrate concentrations. Just this week, as we said at the start of the webinar, we've seen a nationally a 10% reduction in river nitrate concentrations in 2024. However, the southeast continues to have the highest nitrate concentrations, and they're associated with agricultural land use, but also, I suppose, the dominance of free draining soils and a lower effective rainfall in the east and the southeast compared to other parts of the country. The Agriculture Catchments Programme, I suppose it's featured in this series many times, but it was established in 2008 to evaluate Ireland's nitrates action programme and irrigation farming. And in the programme, we've got 6 agricultural catchments, and Castle Dockrell in Wexford is our arable dominant catchment, where we can, I suppose, assess arable farming on water quality. And I suppose over the entire monitoring period, the nitrate concentrations have been at 6.95 milligrams per litre of nitrate N during the monitoring period, and last year it was at 7.1. So they're still too high, so there's still work to be done. As Richie said, the catch crops are effective at reducing nitrate leaching. From a farmer perspective, I suppose they have been able to sow or they've been able to sow cover crops through the agri-environmental schemes, so GLAS in the past and now acres. And there are farmers that sow cover crops voluntarily as well, outside of financial incentive. And in the past 12 months, I suppose we've seen that the cover crops are a measure in the Farming for Water EIP, so they're measure 6. So I suppose there's another avenue there to get support for getting them in the ground. Just a little bit about the program and the principles of how it works. So we follow the nutrient transfer continuum. So we track nutrients, nitrate, phosphorus, and also sediment loss from source. So source will be the farm field level. We do soil sampling every 4 years. We've got local weather stations because we know that climatic conditions are big drivers of nutrient loss. We've done, LiDAR surveying to look at the surface pathways that have now led to the pit maps that we've got available. And we've also got groundwater wells in which we can take water chemistry at different levels. And then I suppose we have high frequency or high resolution monitoring at the catchment outlet. And that's where we can take, I suppose, the nutrient concentrations and other parameters every 10 minutes. And then the impact of all of this is what's happening from an ecological point of view at the catchment in the rivers. And we do an ecological survey twice a year to assess that. In this presentation, I suppose I'm going to talk about some research that we've done at the source scale. So in drainage water, in a lysimeter facility that we've got, we're going to look at data from the below ground pathway. So from the boreholes that we've got in the catchment, and then also the outlet data as well. So it's just important to give an overview of the full spectrum. So this is the Castle Dockrell catchment. It's 1,100 hectares approximately, and that black line there is the catchment boundary. So all of the rainwater that falls within the catchment flows out of the outlet, which is here. And so that's where we can measure the nutrient status every 10 minutes. I mentioned the groundwater wells. So they're in the north and the south of the catchment. So they're the green dots that you see in the north and the south. So we measure water levels, but also the chemistry at different depths in the upper slope, the mid slope, and the near stream in the north of the catchment, and also in the south of the catchment, so that we can look at flow following the topography from the north and the south as it leads into the catchment outlet, essentially. You can see the river network and the different tributaries that lead into the outlet there as well, through the blue lines. And the red stars are where we take monthly snapshot samples as well. So a little overview of the some of the infrastructure that we've got. So this year, Research Officer on Mitigation Measures, Demi Ryan, who's working on the programme, pulled together, I suppose, the data on the catch crops that have been sown through GLAS and acres, together with our catchment advisor, Mark Borland. So you can see the GLAS area sown within the catchment boundary for 2022 is given there first. Then the middle one is the acres area sown that was sown in 2023. And then we've got acres in 2024. So across, I suppose, the 3 years in the agri-environmental schemes, there's been an average of 120 hectares sown. And that's about 20% of the tillage land in Castle Dockrell. If we move on to what happened last year, and I suppose with the availability of the EIP, so In the map there, the blue area again is the acres area that was sown, and then the orange colour is what was sown in the EIP. So there would have been in total 281 hectares sown together if you add in EIP and acres. And overall of the catchment farmers, obviously they have area outside the land as well that they own or that they're leasing, and the total area by those catchment farmers would have been 560 hectares overall last year. So from a percentage increase within the catchment boundary, it was 120% increase in 2024 compared to 2023, and 137% increase from the farmers overall in the areas that they're farming. So quite a significant increase. But what you might see there is there has been a decrease in the area sown under the agro-environmental schemes, going from glass to acres over the last couple of years. So I suppose, why is that? Under the glass scheme, they could sow up to 32 hectares, were funded, and that decreased under the acre scheme to 20 hectares. Obviously, since then, the cost of leasing land has increased significantly. So that's likely, I suppose, to lead to uncertainty about, what land they've got available or what they're able to lease under the acre scheme, and being able to commit to sowing cover crops under that scheme for a period of 5 years. What we've seen with EIP and the feedback that we get back from the farmers, and I spoke to some of them at the Oak Park Open Day last week, is just the flexibility with the EIP, so they can apply and apply for area, and then they get paid for what they actually sow. And payment is quick as well. It seems to move through quite quickly. So that flexibility and the payment rate as well, it seems to be quite attractive to farmers getting cover crops in the ground. So just looking at some work we did in a lysimeter facility in the catchment, and this is on a commercial farm. So we've got below ground lysimeters that allows us to collect drainage water to 1 metre. We did this study in 2022 where we looked at, I suppose, a treatment that was fallow, followed by natural regeneration. And then we had the glass mix that's known commercially as leafy turnip and forage rape. And the first graph here shows a biomass nitrogen uptake in kilos of nitrogen per hectare. You can see that there's a significant increase in crop nitrogen uptake in the cover crop treatment compared to the fallow and natural regeneration. And similarly, there was a significant reduction in nitrate leaching in the cover crop compared to the natural regeneration control. When we look at, I suppose, the groundwater wells that we have, and this is data from the groundwater wells. So the green line represents the north transect, you might remember from the map that I showed earlier on, and the blue line represents the south transect of 3 groundwater wells. So you can see there in 2020, we started to see, I suppose, the separation of those two with regards to the nitrate that we're picking up on average. So the solid blue line is the average across the 3 boreholes that we've got in each of those transects. So in the north of the catchment, I suppose in the fields that are overlaying those boreholes, the land use has been spring barley followed by a cover crop, and there has been another field that's been a grass lay that's been zero grazed. In the south transect, we've had spring barley with a cover crop, but we've had winter barley that's been left winter fallow over those years. So those two different, I suppose, land uses seem to have brought about, I suppose, a reduction in the north well in the groundwater nitrate concentrations compared to the south well, where we've got some area that's been left fallow over the winter. And what we get asked a lot, and where we've seen this big increase in cover crop sown, people want to know, when will we see a benefit of that? And if we look at, and these 3 graphs show, I suppose, the nitrate concentration throughout the year across, I suppose, the years that we've had the programme monitoring at the outlet. And Castle Docker is on the bottom. So you can see it's quite a steady nitrate concentration throughout the year. It doesn't fluctuate hugely compared to if we look at our other groundwater fed catchment, that's largely in grassland and Timoleague. You can see that it really peaks and troughs throughout the year. So this tells us in Castledockrell, in the deeper aquifers, we've just got this high supply of nitrate that it's going to take a couple of years of land use changes, like our cover crops, like we're talking today, in order to reduce that pool of nitrate. So we can see it having an impact at the soil solution level in the lysimeter study. We're seeing an impact, at the groundwater well level, but it's going to take a couple of years of consecutive years of good cover crop area and getting them in earlier before we start to see the dial moving here at the outlet level. So just some on-farm monitoring that we did a couple of years ago, and this complements the control study that Richie showed on sowing date. So we went out and we monitored from September to December cover crops that were sown at different dates. And this was following spring barley. So we the 10th of August, the 20th of August, the 4th of September, and the 10th of December. And you can see just the very obvious effect of sowing date on cover crops. And I suppose last year, you can see that the yield here of the earlier sown ones, was above 1,500 kilos of dry matter per hectare. This is above ground biomass. And those that were sown in September, they just about got over 1,000 kilos of dry matter per hectare towards December. And last year we sampled a number of fields in December for above ground biomass, and following the spring barley crops, they would have been about 500 kilos of dry matter per hectare, so down around here. And following the winter cereals, they were higher. They were about 1,500. We sampled them obviously earlier, but just shows the impact of year, and sowing date is really important. So even though we had a big increase in cover crop area, they went in quite late last year, and so hopefully with the direction of how crops are progressing this year, that hopefully they'll get in good time. And this just showing the crop nitrogen uptake of those. So obviously the earlier sown ones with higher biomass have a higher crop nitrogen uptake as well. So just some of our ongoing work here in Johnstown Castle. So Darragh Houlihan is leading a project funded by the Department of Agriculture called AgriBirds. So this is to look at the synergies and trade-offs between, I suppose, increasing the area of cover crops sown on farms and how they influence the food and feeding of farmland birds. So he's looking at, I suppose, the seed provision in stubbles compared to natural regeneration or stubble cultivation, and also sown cover crops. So that work is on the go for the last year or two. Vertigo is a project that I have where we're looking at plantain inclusion in cover crop mixes, particularly high legume cover crop mixes. As Richie would have shown, there's a potential benefit for the following crop where there's legumes included in the cover crop. And we know from grassland work that plantain can reduce nitrogen loss. So potentially if we put it in cover crop mixes, it may have an impact there. So just moving on that plantain work a little bit. So we'll be doing that in Johnstown Castle, but also in Castledockrell as well. And then Patrick Forrestal and his PhD student Dan Coonan are looking at, they've got a rotation experiment here, a low nitrogen rotation experiment here in the lysimeter facility in Johnstown. And across 5 soil types, they're looking, I suppose they've looked, the cover crop treatments are part of their rotation as well for winter cover. So last year they looked at rye and vetch, and they had a stubble cultivation control then as well to compare to. So that's just some of the work we have ongoing here in Johnstown. So to finish up, I suppose, as Richie has said already, cover crops can significantly reduce nitrogen loss, and we're seeing that in the catchment as well. Early sowing is important. I suppose plant species is inclusion is important. The area that we saw sown on cover crops increased greatly in 2024 with the availability of the EIP funding. And that DIP, I suppose, was planned up to the end of 2027. And that's been extended now to the end of 2029. So going back to my point on getting consecutive years of good cover crops, the EIP is going to be there, and hopefully that will help move the dial at a catchment scale. The cover crops in work that we did where we surveyed farmers and stakeholders, they're viewed very positively by farmers, and they're motivated not just by water quality benefits, but also by soil health and structure as well. And in that work, we would have seen, I suppose, the importance of participatory approaches to knowledge transfer and getting new research or technical information out to farmers on cover crops. They have a preference for discussion groups and demonstrations and farm walks. And, cross-industry level collaboration is important. So, there's industry have quite a lot ongoing in cover crops, and it's important, I suppose, that we all work together on it.
That's super. Thanks a million, Bridget. And Richie, really excellent presentation. So maybe if everyone turn the cameras back on again, that was a quite robust rundown on the research behind catch crops from a plot scale all the way up to a catchment scale, which is excellent. And next week we're going to follow up then on the real practical side of it, from putting them in the ground and all the pros and cons and what can go right and what can go wrong. But Bridget, there's one slide I'll start out with you because you just finished, and it really put you to the mast. But policy seems to dictate an awful lot around catch crops. Like you mentioned acres and the changes from acres to the EIP and the flexibility and the amount of ground getting sown. It is like everything else, no matter how good a tool is, does policy have the key role to play in it to pay farmers? Because we know tillage money is, we've looked at the other sectors doing quite well at the moment. Tillage is still, not down at the bottom of it. Is it important?
From a farmer's perspective, it's really important. And I think it's quite obvious from the areas sown there, the trend that we are seeing in Castle Dockrell, that, there's quite a good bit of risk with subscribing to sow and cover crops in the agri-environmental schemes. If they get an inspection or something like that, the risk of getting a penalty, if they run into an issue in an inspection, compared to the EIP, I suppose, where they can, submit their applications and the deadline is gone now for this year, but they get paid on what they sow. So if they don't sow what they've submitted for, there isn't a penalty. And look, we've fed this. We work in the programme very closely with the Department of Agriculture in the Water and Air Quality Division, and we have fed that back to them. So they are aware of it. And look, they want to know this so that they can try and make the schemes that they have available for farmers better. So.
Yeah, and I think they are listening, because they have allowed changes within the IP even for a little bit more flexibility. So that's very positive. Yeah. And Richie, you mentioned the Dust Bowl, and a lot of tillage farmers will be familiar with the Dust Bowl. Was there many key learnings from the Dust Bowl and cover crops and catch crops? Or?
Yeah, well, I guess it really instilled their usefulness as a tool to protect your soil. And I suppose we usually don't have a problem with dust bowls here in Ireland. It's excess water is our problem, and we know that the cover crops or the catch crops can have a very positive effect there in terms of reducing surface runoff, and many growers will comment that the water running off their fields where there is a cover crop will be a lot. Will have a lot less soil than say running off a bare stubble field. So yeah, I think it's that there is a lot of the information that was generated in those times is still valid today.
Yeah. Shay, a lot of questions come in, so I'll let you take a few of those there now.
Yeah, I'm kind of going to try and group them into kind of themes of some of these questions because some of them are kind of similar sort of themes, Cathal. So the first one I'm going to ask maybe Richie about, and I can maybe comment on one of them myself, is in terms of crop destruction. When you're trying to get rid of these crops afterwards, are you better off to plow in cover crops or spray them off, or should you chop them and roll them prior to desiccating them? And the final part of that question, Richie, I'm not sure whether you want to answer it or not, is we had a demonstration last week of that crop zone machine, whether that's an effective way of doing it. So maybe you take the first two parts, and if you like, I can take the last part.
Yeah, there's probably no right way to destroy a cover crop, and it probably depends on what cover crop you have. There was some work done in the UK looking at different methods of destroying cover crops there relatively recently, and they were finding that it was better to spray off the cover crops they had with glyphosate rather than to roll them or chop them or whatever. We have done it. We have sprayed off cover crops, and we have generally ploughed them back in with a green as well in comparison, and we haven't always seen a huge difference between the two methods. So yeah, I think it's probably something that there's a bit of work left to be done. We do need to take into account, of course, the risk of carryover of diseases or whatever. If there's a lot of volunteer cereals, then I'd be either ploughing well in advance of sowing or applying a glyphosate well in advance of sowing to avoid that problem. And I'll let you answer the one on the electric machine.
Yeah, so for anybody who's not familiar with it, we demonstrated a new machine here last week, which is kind of a prototype machine, which electrocutes crops. And in the case last week, we're electrocuting potato crops to destruct the hollow. And there are hoods and that you can change on that machine to desiccate the likes of cover crops. I haven't seen it yet. I'm sure you probably haven't seen it working yet. But I suppose the thing about it is new technology. It is developing. And basically, the way it's used is that the electricity generated by the machine is used to destroy the cells in the plant and thereby killing them. So we have to kind of wait and see more information on that type of machine or that type of approach to give a good evaluation of it. Just another couple of questions here. You mentioned lysimeters, both yourself and Bridget, and I suppose the question here was, is it used to measure nitrogen uptake and leaching? And if so, how do lysimeters work?
Well, maybe I'll speak about a little bit of work that we did. So what we used were what are called porous ceramic suction cups. So these are little. If you break your teacup or whatever, you'll see that the central part of it that's not enameled is quite porous, and you bury these cups into the soil with a tube coming to the surface, and they will suck in water over the autumn winter period. And periodically, you will take samples of that water and measure the amount of nitrate in it. And if you know how much water is draining through your soil, you can calculate the amount of leaching. So they're specifically used to measure leaching. And crop uptake you would measure by taking crop samples. The lysimeters that Bridget showed, the lysimeter system in Johnstown, I might let Bridget answer that one.
Yeah, so the lysimeters, they allow you to collect actual drainage. So for the ceramic cups, you calculate drainage sort of through a calculation from local weather conditions. So the lysimeters, you take an intact core from the field, and then you put, infrastructure around it to allow you to collect the drainage water, and you have piping coming out, and that goes back into the ground. So the ones that we have in Castledockrell in the commercial field, like the farmer essentially is able to plough and do whatever he needs to over those lysimeters in that facility. So they're in-ground lysimeters. And then the lysimeter facility here in Johnstown, we have in-ground or in-field ones, but we have ones that are separate that we sow crops or grass or whatever on top of, and it allows us to collect the drainage, and we can get that tested and measured then to work out concentration and load.
While you have the microphone, Bridget, a question probably closer to your heart down there than also up here in terms of the problems around Ladies Island and Wexford. Are cover crops and tree covers or planting trees and buffers and measures like that, do you think would they be effective in helping the Ladies Island situation down there in Wexford?
Yeah, well, I'm sure there is some tillage area that feeds into Ladies Island, and cover crops are going to stop that nutrient loss during the winter period, and then I'm sure the buffers will stop, any overland flow or phosphorus and sediment getting into the area as well and impacting on Ladies Island. And I think there's historical issues there with, it traditionally was a big area for potatoes. So,
Easy on the poor spud
sediment and phosphorus issues from that historically. Cathal maybe might be able to build on, maybe more familiar with the issue down there.
Yeah, there's mixtures of grassland and some arable down there as well. But the question is dead right, and the answer is dead right. Like the more of any of these tools that we put in, it will reduce losses from any farmlands to any water source. So yeah, the more the merrier.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Couple of questions here on biodiversity and greenhouse gas emissions. So I'm going to try and summarize them all here in terms of maybe one question for both Bridget and for Richie. In terms of the greenhouse gas emissions, do either of you have any comment on the increase in carbon dioxide or nitrous oxides from sowing cover crops? And I suppose the other one, in terms of biodiversity, are catch crops linked to improve biodiversity, both soil and I suppose above ground biodiversity as well?
Maybe I'll do the nitrous oxide one. So there's some work about to start on the effect of cover crops in tillage systems on nitrous oxide emissions. But if we look internationally, there's some studies that say they will have a small positive effect on it will increase nitrous oxide emissions, and some studies say that they have little or no, or maybe even a small negative effect. So it's difficult to be very conclusive. It probably depends a lot on the actual cover crop. Something like maybe a mixture with a lot of legumes in it might be more susceptible to producing nitrous oxide than something from a non-leguminous cover crop. I suppose the thing we have to take into account as well, that when we look at net greenhouse gas emissions, cover crops are putting carbon back into the soil. So even though they might be releasing nitrous oxide, when we look at all the gases involved, there's probably a net gain to be had with the cover crops. And maybe I'll leave the biodiversity one to Bridget if she wishes.
Yeah, I'll pick up on the CO2. We've got an Edic variance tower in the catchment on a continuous tillage site, and I suppose wherever you're promoting photosynthesis, you're going to capture carbon dioxide. So we would see that the land area, if it's in spring barley, for example, that it can be a source of CO2 as the plant starts to dry down and senesce as you come up to harvest. But once greening starts, or you sow a cover crop through a non-inversion method, obviously, once that greening starts and the plant comes up and they start to photosynthesis, that we see that from a flux point of view, that this becomes a sink of CO2. But obviously, we've a couple other ecovariance towers in the NASCO network that are on tillage soil, so we're going to gain more information on that in time over the next couple of years. On the biodiversity side, so I suppose I would say people that are concerned about bird populations and that would say that cover crops are very bad for birds. They provide coverage for some birds, through the canopy over the winter, those that I suppose like to seek sort of shelter or whatever in the ground cover. But I suppose the more cover crop area that's sown, there's less stubbles there, and so there's less seeds there after harvest for birds to feed on. So, and that's the whole reason that Dara's doing that project, that surveying project in AgriBird. So he'll have more data on that over the next couple of years. From a soil health point of view, I think that cover crops improve soil health. I'm not familiar with data that at specific data on below ground, I suppose, soil biodiversity, microbial biodiversity on populations or diversity of those, but certainly they've been shown to increase soil health and carbon and organic levels.
Richie,
And is there any research, Bridget, that you're aware of in terms of the production of cover crops and how they affect the local biodiversity? I presume that's in the soil. I presume they're talking about or maybe introducing, say, seeds from God knows where into, say, Wexford, for argument's sake.
No, I mean, I think that they've been shown to increase soil health, and that's around carbon, organic matter point of view, and soil structure. But I haven't seen anything where there's any concern around the seed sources that have come in. Now, could be wrong, but I mean, they're all, I suppose, validated by the Department of Agriculture when they come in. So you'd hope what's coming in isn't having unintended consequences for local environment.
I suppose the Irish seed trade, the members of that bring in cover crops, they would have a quite, I think it's a zero tolerance on a lot of foreign species in their seed, so that would give you some confidence.
Yeah.
Quick one.
Sorry, Cathal, go ahead. Yeah.
Just Richie, you mentioned legumes in cover crops. Do we have to be careful putting legumes into cover crops over the winter period?
Well, legumes on their own, I think wouldn't be advisable, because they tend to be less effective at taking up nitrogen, soil nitrogen. They'll fix it all right, but they tend to be less effective at taking up soil nitrogen. But I think if we put them in mixtures with a non-legume, then the non-legume will take whatever's out of the soil, and then you have the legumes to put nitrogen back into the soil. I suppose where we do need to be careful is when it comes to the following crop. As I said, legumes can probably give more nitrogen back than other non-legumes. We need to probably be able to make a recommendation as to how much the fertilizer nitrogen input should be reduced by, and if we don't, we could be having a net increase in fertilizer inputs, which over time will have an impact on leaching.
And on the opposite side of that, Richie, is there a risk then that cover crops could compete for the nutrients that are in the soil and affect the yield of the succeeding crop, or the following crop, shall I say?
Yeah, well, I mean, the nutrient, if the nutrient wasn't going to be lost, and the cover crop takes it up and makes it unavailable for a period, then there can be an effect of that, and there has been some negative yield effects of cover crops that have been attributed to that. I don't think it's in our conditions, it's probably not a huge factor, I would have thought, because most of the nitrate that's in the soil is probably going to be lost over the winter period, and given the high amount of drainage that we have over our winter periods.
Yeah, a couple of final questions here then for both yourselves. In terms of the nitrous action plan, can this be strengthened by the use of cover crops? And I suppose from that point of view, then, can nitrogen be more directly reduced in farming systems by reducing dairy and beef production and by using cover crops? So it's a whole thing about the whole nitrous action plan and where that's going.
Well, I suppose in the nitrous action plan, you're required to have stubble cultivation on a large proportion of your land is going to be bare not going to have a cash crop on it over the winter period. And as we showed, like natural regeneration, provided there's decent natural regeneration, can reduce leaching. In terms of interaction between beef and dairy, I suppose, and tillage. I suppose my expertise, if you like, is in the tillage area, and we can only really do our bit. Which and as I say, cover crops or catch crops are probably one of the most effective tools we have in terms of reducing leaching.
Just on that natural regen. It's hard to get to the same level of biomass and natural regeneration compared to a cover crop or a catch crop, isn't it? Because if you drive around the fields any winter, there's a big difference.
Yeah, well, it certainly, as I showed there in the slides, the sown cover crop gives you a lot more certainty in terms of an uptake and biomass. But obviously, it brings with it an additional cost as well, and that bit more difficult to get rid of. But yeah, so certainly a sown cover crop we'll do more on most occasions, provided it's sown early, of course. So sowing a cover crop in September isn't going to be a whole pile better than natural regeneration.
Yeah.
And have you? Sorry, Cathal. Quick question.
We'll give you one more there, Shay.
Yeah, two quick questions, Richie. Quick one: which legume is best? And a final question, maybe it's a silly question as the person says it here. Can these catch crops be eaten? I presume that's for human consumption, or can you grow catch crops for human consumption?
In terms of which legume is the best, it depends on what you mean by best, but if it's in terms of supplying nitrogen to the next crop, I would have said something like vetch, maybe hairy vetch, or a winter pea, something like that. Or some of the clovers, provided are sown very early, can be good as well. In terms of human consumption, the cover crop sown in the autumn, not really, but the likes of mustard is grown as a crop in other parts where it's sown in the spring and harvested in whatever, July, August time. But when sown as a cover crop, not really. They're not really going to be used for human consumption. It will be used for animal feed and for grazing sheep and maybe light cattle, that sort of thing.
Yeah,
we better wrap up.
Obviously, there would be grazed by sheep. There'd be a good bit of that in Wexford, and that meat is available for consumption.
Unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. Look, we could have stayed for another half an hour, I'd say, here, because there's lots of really good questions coming in, and it's great to have Bridget and Richie on here to answer those questions. But look, thanks a million for an excellent presentation, Bridget and Richie. Really interesting, and it's a really important topic, and we are going after to try and solve some of our problems. So it's great to get those questions answered. Shay, thanks a million for helping out the questions today. Excellent as always. I just want to thank Mary O'Loughlin in the background for helping out and helping running the webinar there this morning. Next week, Teagasc Advisor and Signpost Programme John Mann is going to join us to discuss the farmer practicalities around growing catch crops. So we discussed a lot of the research benefits today, but often when we're out and about farms, farmers want to know, the trials and tribulations and how to get them in the ground, and lots of what we discussed today, and we'll go into that next week. So that's not to be missed. So do tune in again next Friday, 9:30. But until then, I hope you have a great weekend. Slán go fóill.
You've been listening to the podcast version of the Teagasc Signpost Series, the weekly webinar that promotes and examines sustainability in Irish farming. Don't forget to join us live every Friday morning for our latest webinar. For more, visit teagasc.ie. And you can also rate, review, and subscribe to the Signpost Series on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from. I'm Mark Gibson, and thanks for listening.